Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show. News Talk 95.1 FM, 790 AM KFYO. Joining us right now, GOP political strategist. And he's also got his own podcast along with numerous columns. It's Matt Mackowiak. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
Going great, Chad. Good morning. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get into political news, because there is political news that is out there. It's carried over from the weekend to today. I want to get your reaction. At some point, and it may begin today, maybe it's already started, President Trump and the administration's response so far to what's happening down in Houston. The last thing that everyone's going to compare it to is Hurricane Katrina and the response at that point. Obviously, we've learned a lot, and governments, local on up, have learned a lot since Hurricane Katrina. How do you view the response so far to what we're seeing down in the Houston area?
Yeah, based on everything we've seen, it looks like the administration's response has been pretty good. I think that's what you're hearing from local officials, folks in both parties. President's been engaged, Vice President's been engaged, Cabinet has been engaged. FEMA Director Brock Long, who was the head of emergency management in the state of Alabama previously, appears to really understand what's going on and is doing everything they can. You saw the disaster declaration at the federal level get approved in record time. Since that time, governors requested some additional counties, including Harris County in Houston. But yeah, so far it's been pretty good. I think one thing to keep in mind is, FEMA really is there for the recovery. They're less prepared and less sort of suited for when something is actually happening. Disaster response is done at the state and local level more than anything else. Now, the feds have resources that they can bring to bear. They have assets they can bring to bear. You're seeing other states send emergency personnel and helicopters and supplies and other things. But in this case, it looks like they did just about everything they could to pre-position assets, to move quickly. Obviously, the question that's getting all the attention right now is whether the city of Houston should have evacuated ahead of time. It's understandable in the middle of a crisis like this. City officials are pretty defensive about even being asked the question, let alone having to answer it. From everything I've read, I think it was almost impossible to know which areas were going to flood in Houston,
right?
Because of how quickly this thing was moving. And so, I don't know how you evacuate several million people in a city in a period of 2 or 3 days. We saw in Rita, the Hurricane Rita timeframe, they tried to evacuate, and you had people that died on the highway. So those highways obviously would be death traps, because if you look and see how flooded they've become, if you have thousands, tens of thousands of people in cars on those highways when the flooding occurs, you'd have an even worse death toll. So far, I think there's only 2 or 3 confirmed deaths, even though this is a 500-year flood. So, look, I think the feds have, from what I've seen, the feds have responded well. The governor gave the president and his team an A+ so far. But the recovery is going to be a multi-year effort.
And what is that? And what does that mean as far as boiling it down to a statewide level? Because at some point, won't this have an impact on the state legislature? Won't this have an impact on the rainy day fund? Will this have an impact in those areas?
Yeah, very well could. Because of how bad the damage is, they haven't been able to do assessments yet of estimates for how much total damage there is. And of course, there's going to be more damage because it sounds like the storm is heading back out to the ocean to gather warm water, and it may come back in East Texas, perhaps on the outskirts of Houston, the next couple of days. So, sure, there's going to be a federal disaster appropriation. That'll happen this fall. Could happen in September, perhaps October, depending on how quickly they get the estimate to the feds. I'm sure the state will need to do something as well. I don't want to alarm anyone too much, but I could imagine a scenario where they need to call a special session to pass an appropriation for the recovery effort. And yes, they could perhaps tap the rainy day fund. I think I saw State Rep Ron Simmons from the Dallas-Fort Worth area suggest that a couple days ago on Twitter, that this would be a much better way to spend money on a one-time disaster than what some of the Democrats in the House were trying to use the rainy day fund during the special session. So, I think all those things are on the table. I think it's still too early to know exactly how it's all going to play out and what the timeline is going to be.
Let's move on to politics. And you still have Congress there in recess. They'll get back next week is when they'll get back into session. I had Senator Cornyn on the show last week. He said that it would be extremely difficult for Obamacare to get passed this year. Looking into what we've talked about before, Matt, with 2018 being an election year, if it's not going to happen this year, do you think it's going to happen at all next year during an election year? And does it mean that we're maybe looking at 2019 after a full collapse, which we think will happen? Are we waiting 2 years now for Obamacare to be repealed?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways to look at this. I think the first is that you have some uncertainty about the Senate in the short term here. One question that we have to get answered is what happens to the Democratic U.S. Senator from New Jersey who's facing a corruption trial that starts next week. He could, if he's convicted, he could obviously resign. He could potentially be removed from the Senate. So that would potentially offer a 50th Republican vote because you have a Republican governor in New Jersey. So the math there could change. I think what Senator Cornyn is trying to get at is that there is no pathway forward on health care right now that they can get done this year. I think they want to let this bipartisan effort in the Senate Health Committee go forward, the Lamar Alexander, Patty Murray effort. You also have the Graham-Cassidy amendment, which is being put together, which is going to block grant money to states and is trying to get governors to support that provision. So I think you have a couple different things that are kind of developing. I think that the Republicans up on Capitol Hill feel like they got to get through September, which has the debt ceiling and the government spending bill, and those are both going to be heavy lifts. And then they're going to try to move tax reform. They're going to try and move through both houses and get to the president's desk by Thanksgiving, ideally, and by the end of the year otherwise. So I think they feel like if they do that, that may be enough, particularly if they can get a victory, maybe some border wall funding in the spending bill. But I don't think they're giving up on health care. I just think the urgency and the possibility of doing anything soon is pretty remote at this point. But you're right. I mean, you're going to have rate increases come through in late September. People are going to start seeing that. That could create new urgency, perhaps a new possibility for bipartisan efforts. But yeah, I mean, it's frustrating because we could be looking, at 2 years, like you said. I mean, I don't know that next year they're going to be in a position to do anything on Obamacare unless they do it in a sweeping bipartisan way, and I doubt that that's going to come with very much reform at all.
It also looks as though tax reform may be in peril for this year as well. Correct?
That's not my sense so far.
Okay.
I think they've been working pretty aggressively behind the scenes with the so-called Big Six, the leaders in the House and Senate, and the Ways and Means and Finance Committee chairs in the House and Senate. So they basically have the 6 top people that have been working on this with the White House, with the Treasury Secretary, and with Gary Cohn, the National Economic Council Director. I think they're getting fairly close to a final plan. I thought it was a positive step that the White House is not going to release their own plan. They're going to let the House Ways and Means plan effectively be the White House plan. So I think the House will move as soon as they move the debt ceiling increase and the government spending bill. I think they'll turn their attention to tax reform. I do think there's a good chance they can pass it this year. I think there's greater unanimity among Republicans on tax reform than there was on health care, and they know they have to do something this year. And if they make the tax cuts retroactive, which they're planning to do, that's going to juice the economy almost immediately, and it'll give us a whole other year next year of stronger economic growth with that tax reform package. But yeah, I mean, if they somehow fail to pass tax reform this year and they, end the year empty-handed on anything significant, that's going to be a true disaster. And I think Republican voters would certainly be keeping that in mind as the primaries come around next year.
Yeah, Matt, tell folks the latest with your podcast and any columns you have out and how they can sign up for that email.
Appreciate that. Yeah, latest episode is with a reporter from Yahoo News named John Ward. He's actually doing a book on the Jimmy Carter-Ted Kennedy presidential primary when Jimmy Carter was an incumbent president in 1980. And looking to see what that was like, and maybe looking forward to whether Trump would perhaps be primaried. You asked about tax reform. My previous episode of the podcast was with Grover Norquist, the Americans for Tax Reform president. So anyone that wants to learn more about tax reform, that's a great conversation. You can find my podcast, Mac on Politics, in the iTunes Store, on Google Play, on Stitcher, and on the web at maconpolitics.com. I also have a morning email that goes out Monday through Friday at mustreadtexas.com.
All right, Matt, as always, appreciate your time, and we'll visit with you later on.
Sounds good. Have a great week. Take care.
Thanks, Matt.